This morning, October 18th, Moscow woke up to a disaster that no one saw coming. At 6:15 local time, multiple explosions tore through the Ryazan oil refinery, one of Russia's largest and most critical energy facilities. Within minutes, fire engulfed several major processing units, sending thick black smoke into the air that could be seen from the capital itself, more than 200 kilometers away. Officially, authorities called it a technical malfunction. Unofficially, every signal pointed to something far more serious, a precision strike. According to preliminary data obtained by independent analysts, at least 5 drones approached the refinery's perimeter from multiple directions, bypassing radar systems designed to protect one of the most heavily guarded industrial zones in the country. The timing, the trajectory, the precision, none of it looked accidental. Even the Russian military, long confident in its layered air defenses, was forced to admit that an aerial intrusion of unknown origin had occurred. By mid-morning, the flames were still burning, and the government had not offered a single credible explanation. The Ryazan complex isn't just any facility. It supplies nearly a fifth of Moscow's gasoline and aviation fuel, as well as large portions of Russia's central and western markets. When production halted, fuel pipelines and storage depots automatically shut down in a cascade of safety measures that rippled across the entire energy grid. Within hours, fuel prices in the capital spiked, and long lines began forming at gas stations. Videos circulated online of motorists arguing at pumps, of signs reading, "No fuel until delivery," and of silent queues stretching into the distance. Inside the Kremlin, the first hours were described by one official as confusion at the highest level. The Ministry of Energy issued 2 contradictory statements: first, that production was unaffected, and then, that temporary disruptions were being resolved. The Defense Ministry refused to comment altogether. According to sources close to the Security Council, emergency meetings began before dawn and continued without pause. One insider described the mood bluntly: "They're panicking. No one knows how something like this reached so deep into the heart of Russia." For Moscow's residents, the shock wasn't just economic, it was psychological. The belief that the capital was untouchable, protected by an invisible shield of power, collapsed in a single morning. Social media filled with images of the smoke cloud rising over the horizon, accompanied by a phrase that spread faster than censorship could catch it: "If Ryazan burns, Moscow isn't safe." In a city already strained by inflation and shortages, the symbolism was devastating. The fire wasn't just destroying infrastructure, it was burning through the illusion of control. International analysts immediately began comparing the attack to earlier strikes on energy infrastructure, but none had hit this close to the Russian capital before. "This isn't just sabotage," said one European defense official. "It's a message that Moscow's shield can be breached." Western intelligence sources confirmed that the strike bore the hallmarks of coordinated precision, but declined to specify who might be behind it. Meanwhile, Russian state television showed footage of firefighters battling the blaze, accompanied by music meant to evoke resilience. The effect was the opposite: viewers saw desperation. As the smoke thickened and the questions multiplied, the Kremlin faced a choice it has long feared: admit vulnerability or risk losing credibility. So far, it has done neither. By midday, the official line remained unchanged: the situation is under control. But in expert circles, few believed that. When they say it's under control, one former government advisor remarked, "That's when you know it isn't." Subscribe to stay ahead of what unfolds next, because, according to insiders, the explosion at Ryazan is only the first sign of a deeper, coordinated campaign aimed not just at Russia's energy grid, but at its confidence itself. By midday, Moscow's crisis had spiraled into what one government insider called a managed collapse. The fire at the Ryazan refinery still burned, though officials insisted it was localized. Yet satellite imagery released by independent observers told a different story: entire sections of the facility had been obliterated. The main refining column, the catalytic cracking units, and the fuel storage depots were gone, nothing but twisted metal and scorched earth. Engineers privately admitted what no one on state television would dare to say: the plant was beyond repair. The economic impact was immediate. Fuel deliveries to the Moscow region were halted completely. Gas stations across the city ran dry by noon. Long queues formed along the ring road as drivers searched desperately for the last station still pumping fuel. Public transport authorities announced temporary adjustments, a phrase that quickly became synonymous with paralysis. Buses stopped running, delivery trucks stalled, and food distributors began warning that supply chains could collapse within 48 hours. Panic was no longer just visible, it was measurable. According to data leaked from the Ministry of Industry and Trade, Russia's strategic fuel reserves were at their lowest levels in nearly a decade, depleted by months of exports and logistical strain. With Ryazan offline, the government's contingency plans were already failing. Oil companies were instructed to redirect supplies from Tatarstan and the Urals, but the infrastructure simply couldn't handle the transfer speed. "They've built a system where everything depends on one point," said a senior energy analyst in Moscow. Now that point is gone. Inside the Kremlin, the tone shifted from denial to damage control. A special session of the Security Council was convened just before noon, described by participants as chaotic and circular. The defense minister demanded immediate retaliation, calling the strike a coordinated act of aggression. The prime minister urged restraint, warning that escalation without proof could trigger panic in financial markets. But the most telling reaction came from the president himself: silence. He listened, said little, and left the room without issuing clear orders. That silence rippled through the bureaucracy like an electric current. No one knew whether to speak, act, or wait. Meanwhile, financial markets entered free fall. The ruble crashed past emergency thresholds within hours. The Moscow exchange briefly halted trading, citing technical instability. Banks quietly imposed withdrawal limits, and rumors spread that capital controls were imminent. The panic wasn't confined to ordinary citizens, it had reached the elite. In corporate offices, executives began moving funds abroad, while government agencies froze budgets until clarification. The same phrase appeared in a leaked memo from the finance ministry: await clarification. But no clarification came. Internationally, the event triggered shock and speculation. Oil prices surged to their highest level in over a year, as global traders scrambled to assess the scale of the disruption. Western intelligence officials, speaking anonymously, confirmed that the attack bore advanced coordination characteristics, simultaneous strikes, synchronized timing, precision impact. Yet what alarmed analysts most was not the sophistication of the operation, but its location. Never before had a strike reached so close to Moscow, bypassing the core of Russia's air defenses. "This isn't just about oil," said one European diplomat. "It's about vulnerability. Someone wanted to prove that the fortress has cracks." Within hours, Russian state television switched tone. The usual triumphal rhetoric gave way to a softer vocabulary: resilience, unity, calm. The word attack was never mentioned. Instead, anchors spoke of an incident under review. But viewers weren't convinced. Social media filled with images of the inferno reflected in the windows of passing trains, and of gas stations displaying signs reading, "Fuel unavailable until further notice." Memes appeared comparing the fire to the last days of the Soviet Union, an empire burning from its own contradictions. By early afternoon, Moscow streets began to empty. Taxis stopped taking rides. Buses slowed to a crawl. At major intersections, police directed traffic without vehicles to direct. The silence was unsettling, a capital suddenly stripped of its noise, its motion, its confidence. And as the hours passed, a new emotion began to take hold, not fear, but disbelief. "We were told this couldn't happen," one resident said on a live stream. "And yet, here we are." Inside government ministries, the disbelief was shared. Several senior officials, speaking privately, admitted that the crisis had exposed something long suspected but never said aloud: the illusion of control. "We built everything on the promise that Moscow was untouchable," one official said. "Now that promise is ash." By midday, it was clear that the Ryazan attack was more than an explosion. It was a message, not just to Russia's enemies, but to Russia itself. And as one analyst put it, the most dangerous thing about losing control is that you don't notice it until it's already gone. Subscribe to stay ahead, because, according to multiple sources, this was only the beginning. Intelligence briefings warn that Ryazan may not have been the only target. The next strike, they say, may come closer. Much closer. By early afternoon, the fire that had started as a distant column of smoke over the Ryazan refinery had evolved into a full-blown national emergency. Moscow, usually insulated from chaos, was now living it in real time. The sky above the southern horizon still carried a dull, gray haze. Air traffic into the capital was reduced. The city's streets, normally a torrent of engines, had turned into long, silent queues at every remaining gas station. Ordinary life, the sound of horns, the hum of machinery, the rhythm of routine, was dissolving. For the first time in decades, Russia's capital looked fragile. Inside the Kremlin, that fragility was felt as panic disguised as protocol. According to multiple sources, the morning Security Council meeting had ended without resolution. Orders contradicted one another. The Defense Ministry demanded restoration of deterrence, but the Ministry of Energy admitted privately that operations couldn't resume for weeks, possibly months. The president, still absent from public view, had not addressed the nation. His silence was now being interpreted in different ways, by citizens as detachment, by officials as uncertainty, by markets as confirmation that no one was in charge. "He's waiting," one senior aide told reporters off record. But for what, no one knows. That waiting became the country's defining mood. In the absence of direction, ministries began improvising. Governors across central Russia were ordered to establish regional fuel committees, bureaucratic shells meant to project control. Local authorities, meanwhile, had no fuel to distribute. Agricultural vehicles were grounded. Emergency services rationed supplies. Hospitals received priority access to reserves, but deliveries faltered. "We're running an entire region on fumes," said a regional energy official. "Everything depends on tankers that might never arrive." In Moscow's financial district, traders described the day as slow-motion collapse. The ruble continued its downward spiral. Foreign investors liquidated remaining Russian assets, while domestic corporations froze transactions. Inside the central bank, a crisis memo circulated with a phrase that leaked to the press within hours: liquidity containment through perception management. In simpler terms, keep people calm until the numbers stop mattering. But by the time the memo reached media circles, the perception had already shifted. Confidence, once the foundation of Russia's economic machine, had evaporated. On state television, the tone grew increasingly surreal. Anchors spoke about temporary logistical realignments, avoiding any reference to the refinery. Instead, they aired footage of volunteers planting trees and soldiers delivering aid to unnamed regions. But the illusion couldn't hold. Telegram channels and independent journalists were filling the vacuum. Videos showed massive plumes of smoke still rising from the refinery site, emergency helicopters circling overhead, and convoys of military vehicles moving south from Moscow. The footage spread faster than sensors could block it. The word Ryazan became synonymous not just with the disaster, but with exposure, the moment the system's mask slipped. By mid-afternoon, reports emerged of unrest in several industrial cities. In Tula, truck drivers blocked a fuel depot, demanding clarity on rationing. In Lipetsk, local police refused to disperse protesters, citing lack of fuel to reach the site. The absurdity of the situation, a security apparatus immobilized by its own shortages, became a dark joke across social media. "Russia's tanks can't move, but the rumors can," one user wrote. Even among loyal commentators, the rhetoric shifted from anger to fatigue. "We are strong," one state journalist wrote online, "but tired of pretending we are invincible." Within the intelligence community, a different kind of panic took root. Preliminary analyses suggested that the drones that struck Ryazan were launched from within Russian territory, an inside operation. The detail was classified immediately, but word leaked through unofficial channels. "That's when everyone stopped breathing," said one defense analyst. Because it meant it wasn't just a breach of defense, it was a breach of trust. The prospect of internal sabotage, long dismissed as impossible, now hovered over every conversation in Moscow's corridors of power. The notion that the enemy might be inside the system, perhaps inside the government itself, deepened the unease. In foreign capitals, the response was cautious but telling. NATO intelligence confirmed increased Russian military alertness, though without visible troop movements. European markets braced for oil shocks, and governments quietly prepared contingency reserves. Yet behind diplomatic language, Western officials privately admitted astonishment. "It's not the scale of the attack," said one European energy advisor. "It's the reaction. We're watching a government implode under its own secrecy." By late afternoon, Moscow's atmosphere had shifted from panic to eerie calm, the kind that follows realization. Traffic lights blinked over empty intersections. Billboards promoting national resilience looked like relics from another era. Conversations in cafes were hushed, not from fear but disbelief. "It's like the Soviet collapse," one middle-aged man told a reporter. "But this time, it's digital. Everyone's watching it happen live." Inside the Kremlin compound, sources describe long, tense hours as aides drafted and redrafted a possible presidential address. One version blamed foreign adversaries. Another spoke vaguely of technical incidents. None sounded convincing. Each rewrite grew shorter, each paragraph more hollow. "They're afraid to speak," said one staffer. "Every word could make it worse." And so, as evening approached, the state that had defined itself by control stood motionless. The refinery still burned, the markets still fell, and the public still waited. The silence from the top, once a weapon, had become an admission. The fortress had not been breached by bombs, but by disbelief. And yet, intelligence sources warn, Ryazan may only be the beginning. Intercepts suggest that further infrastructure targets have been mapped. The phrase circulating within the defense ministry tonight is simple and chilling: the next wave. By late afternoon, Moscow had entered a state of suspended reality, a city still standing, but no longer functioning as the capital of control it once embodied. The official narrative had disintegrated under the weight of visible truth. The Ryazan refinery wasn't merely damaged, it was annihilated. Satellite imagery, now circulating globally, showed a cratered landscape where Russia's largest processing units once stood. The fire, which authorities claimed was contained, continued to rage uncontrollably. And for the first time in decades, the Kremlin could not silence the evidence. In the streets, the mood was shifting from disbelief to quiet anger. Gas stations remained empty. Food deliveries had slowed to a trickle. Commuters walked home because buses were cancelled, and taxis refused to run. Long queues formed outside ATMs as citizens tried to withdraw whatever cash was left. "They say it's under control," one woman said on a live stream from the edge of a shuttered gas station, "but there's nothing left to control." The stream was deleted minutes later, but not before it was viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Inside the government, desperation replaced denial. According to multiple sources, 3 emergency committees were formed in the Kremlin throughout the day, one for logistics, one for security, one for information control. None could agree on what to do. The Ministry of Energy warned that reserves would last no more than 3 days at current consumption rates. The central bank pleaded for a freeze on energy exports, but state corporations resisted, fearing bankruptcy. "Every agency is defending its own survival," said a senior insider. "No one is defending the system anymore." As the fractures widened, regional leaders began acting independently. Governors in the Volga and central federal districts imposed local rationing without federal approval. Others stopped sending shipments to Moscow altogether, citing infrastructure priorities. For a state built on centralized obedience, the implications were catastrophic. "We are witnessing fragmentation," said one Russian economist. "The command structure is breaking apart under pressure. The center gives orders, but the regions no longer listen." Meanwhile, panic spread among the political elite. Several members of the Federation Council reportedly fled Moscow for their dachas outside the city. Private jet activity from Vnukovo Airport tripled in the span of 4 hours. One flight tracker showed multiple departures to Yerevan, Dubai, and Istanbul. "They're not running from bombs," said one source close to the presidential administration. "They're running from uncertainty." Even among Putin's closest circle, communication had become erratic. Ministers stopped answering direct calls. Advisors communicated through intermediaries. The state, once rigidly vertical, was dissolving into silence and suspicion. But the greater danger wasn't physical collapse, it was the collapse of narrative. On state television, the day's broadcasts had turned surreal. Anchors repeated that fuel supplies remained stable, while black smoke filled the sky outside Moscow. One channel aired a pre-recorded segment about advances in drone defense technology, which viewers quickly mocked as parody. Memes flooded Telegram, burning refineries paired with captions like, "Defense tested successfully." Censors tried to delete them, but it was too late. Even loyal citizens stopped believing. The illusion of control, so carefully maintained over decades, had been incinerated in a single day. In the diplomatic sphere, the Kremlin's silence was beginning to alarm its allies. Beijing, usually measured, reportedly requested direct clarification regarding the attack. Tehran offered emergency technical assistance, but Moscow declined, unwilling to admit the extent of the damage. "They've entered the isolation phase," one European diplomat explained. "They can't ask for help without exposing weakness. But by not asking, they show it anyway." Inside Russia's military command, paranoia was spreading faster than orders. A classified report circulated among senior officers warning that the strike on Ryazan may have been internally enabled. Investigators discovered evidence suggesting that the drone's flight paths exploited precise gaps in radar coverage, information that could only come from within. "That's when the atmosphere changed completely," said one source familiar with the briefing. "They stopped talking about sabotage and started whispering about infiltration." The implication was existential: the state might no longer know who works for whom. By early evening, foreign intelligence intercepted Russian troop movements around major energy sites, including in Bryansk and Oryol. The Kremlin was fortifying infrastructure it could barely operate. Yet the show of force was not reassuring, it was desperate. Armored vehicles patrolled highways, not against an enemy army, but against the fear of losing control. Soldiers guarded fuel depots that had no fuel left to protect. For ordinary Russians, the image of military trucks blocking gas stations became the day's defining symbol. "We're guarding emptiness," one officer reportedly muttered. The phrase spread quickly, capturing the mood of a country defending the shell of a system already hollowed out from within. As night approached, the power grid began to strain. Rolling blackouts were reported in Moscow's outer districts as the city attempted to conserve fuel for emergency generators. Trains ran at reduced schedules, and flights from Sheremetyevo were delayed indefinitely. What had begun as an industrial disaster was now consuming the state's ability to function. "It's not just the refinery that's burning," said one commentator on a banned independent channel. "It's the architecture of control." And somewhere inside the Kremlin's walls, amid flickering monitors and muffled voices, a final question was being asked behind closed doors, one that no one dared to voice publicly. If the system built on fear no longer inspires fear, what is left to hold it together? The fire in Ryazan was still burning. But in the minds of Russia's elite, something else had already collapsed, something invisible, but far more permanent. The certainty that tomorrow would resemble today. By nightfall, Moscow was no longer the city it had been that morning. The smoke from the Ryazan inferno had drifted high above the capital, blotting out the horizon. From certain rooftops, the faint orange glow was still visible, a quiet, burning reminder of everything the government had failed to control. The streets were subdued, the air heavy with the smell of fuel and tension. Officially, the situation was stable. Unofficially, it was chaos wrapped in silence. And that silence, spreading from ministry corridors to apartment kitchens, was the most dangerous signal of all. According to multiple sources within the presidential administration, the final emergency meeting of the day began shortly after 1900 hours. The president did not attend. The prime minister presided instead, flanked by the defense and interior ministers. The agenda: containment of consequences. Each department arrived with its own definition of containment. The energy ministry pushed for the declaration of a national fuel emergency. The defense ministry proposed deploying troops to secure refineries and fuel depots nationwide. The central bank urged a communication campaign to restore confidence. The result was paralysis. "They were arguing about words," said one insider. "Not about solutions." Meanwhile, the capital's infrastructure was buckling. Metro stations were packed, not with commuters, but with citizens waiting out blackouts that swept through the city in rotating waves. ATMs ran out of cash. Gas stations shut down entirely. Hospitals switched to backup generators. Supermarkets dimmed their lights to conserve energy. The mayor's office quietly issued an internal directive urging residents to minimize unnecessary movement. It was the bureaucratic version of an admission: Moscow was running out of fuel, and no one knew how to stop it. The state's propaganda machine, usually ruthless in narrative control, seemed disoriented. Television anchors appeared pale and visibly shaken. Their voices wavered as they repeated pre-written lines about resilience and the stability of supply. On social media, however, reality spoke louder. Videos flooded Telegram: families sitting in dark apartments, cars abandoned along highways, soldiers siphoning gasoline from military trucks. The word collapse was never uttered on air, but it had already entered the nation's vocabulary. Inside the military, tension was nearing a breaking point. According to classified reports leaked to several independent outlets, internal security services had begun investigating officers responsible for regional air defense. The suspicion of sabotage, or worse, betrayal, had become an obsession. Some commanders demanded purges, others quietly warned that such actions could ignite open mutiny. "They don't know who to trust," one former intelligence officer said. And when a regime no longer trusts its own guns, it stops being a regime and starts being a rumor. The international reaction was equally sharp. Oil prices surged past $120 a barrel. Emergency energy summits were called in Brussels and Washington. In Beijing, state media, typically careful not to criticize Moscow, described the Ryazan attack as a destabilizing event with global implications. The message was subtle but clear: even Russia's partners were preparing for instability. "The shock is no longer about the fire," said one Western diplomat. "It's about the realization that Russia's center of gravity just shifted, and no one knows where it will land." Back in Moscow, power flickered again as another blackout rolled through the southern districts. Crowds gathered quietly outside closed petrol stations, the glow of their phones illuminating faces pale with exhaustion. "We thought this was temporary," one man said in a live stream before his signal cut out. "Now it feels like the end of something." The comment spread across the internet, reposted thousands of times before censors erased it, too late, as usual. At 2100 hours, a pre-recorded statement finally aired on national television. The president's voice, measured but detached, declared the situation under control. He blamed external forces for the refinery explosion and promised a swift response. Yet there was no anger in his tone, only fatigue. Even loyal viewers sensed it. The broadcast ended abruptly, fading to a still image of the Kremlin at night. For many, it felt less like reassurance than farewell. Inside the government, the atmosphere after the address was one of quiet resignation. Officials stopped pretending the crisis could be reversed. There was no plan left to implement, one insider said. Only plans to survive the aftermath. Rumors of an emergency economic decree circulated, but none were confirmed. The machine that had once ruled by discipline now moved by inertia, orders delayed, responses lost, departments waiting for a clarity that would never return. And so, as midnight approached, the city descended into uneasy stillness. From the outskirts, the orange glow of the Ryazan fire still pulsed faintly on the horizon, a ghostly beacon of the day everything changed. The noise of engines, once the heartbeat of Moscow, was gone. In its place came a different sound, the low hum of generators and the distant wail of sirens. Experts now agree that this was not just an act of sabotage, but a turning point, the day Russia's illusion of control burned with the refinery that symbolized it. The system built on the myth of stability had discovered its first undeniable truth, that fear alone cannot power a state forever. As one senior analyst told us tonight, the fire at Ryazan will go out. But the fire it started inside the Kremlin will not. Subscribe to stay ahead of what comes next, because, according to our sources, this was not the end of the story. It was the moment Russia began to understand what it means to lose control, not from the outside, but from within.